So we're going to be taking a look at John Mearsheimer's book, How States Think, the Rationality of Foreign Policy. And while this book does have a lot of good insights into foreign policy, I would say even more than that, what really I found gripping about this book is its exploration of the decision-making process. It's a very unique take. It's one that I haven't really seen expressed this way, but it's something that made a lot of sense to me. And it kind of codified a lot of things that I guess I subconsciously or consciously thought about, but puts them together in a very neat, coherent fashion. So while we will be talking a little bit about foreign policy, the focus is more going to be on the decision-making process. We're going to go from the idea that theories are actually a good thing, that it's not just navel-gazing, that it's not just pure abstraction, that it's how people understand the world and how we make sense of things, how to determine if a theory is credible or not, and how the actual rational decision-making process happens. And also dispelling some misconceptions of the rational decision-making process. So I know it sounds a little dry, but trust me, it's interesting. So before we get into the book, just talking a little bit about John Mearsheimer. Most of you are probably aware of him. He is one of the two founders, I guess you could say, of neorealism, along with Kenneth Waltz. In particular, Kenneth Waltz's conception of neorealism is now known as defensive realism, whereas Mearsheimer's is known as offensive realism. So he's always been very well respected, and I remember reading some of his stuff back in university, but he's had a real resurgence in his career lately, at least in my interpretation. He had very heterodox views on the Russo-Ukraine war, like he blamed NATO for a lot of it. He said a lot of it was provoked by America's actions. He's extremely critical of neoconservatism and democracy promotion. And probably most controversially, he's a big critic of the Israel lobby. If you watch any kind of I don't know what you call them, independent media podcasts like the Duran or Daniel Davis Deep Dive, he goes on there a lot, and it's just for his point of view, I'm glad that his ideas are getting out to a whole new generation of young thinkers through this kind of new media format. But I digress. So How States Think can be seen, at least in my view, as his magnum opus. If you go through the preface to this book, it talks about how long and torturous the writing process was. This was written during COVID, and he said he spent about 4 hours a day plus on Zoom just working on this book, that it went through 3 or 4 different revisions. And a lot of that is because it covered a lot of topics and ideas that he hadn't really seen elsewhere. So that being said, let's get into How States Think. So the book itself is an extensive exploration into the state's decision-making process that attempts to dispel a lot of the myths and memes about foreign policy and the rationality of state actors. It's very common to think that the actions of people, and this is not just states, but just individuals in your life and organizations, behave in an irrational manner. That emotionality drives everything, that there's no thought process to things. But in a lot of cases, there is a rational decision-making process and there was deliberation. It's just they may not be using the same kind of theory that you are, or have the same priorities or the same perspective, but that doesn't make their decision irrational per se. And so I've covered most of this earlier on, so let's go to the next slide. So some of the assumptions that he lays out in the book are, as I said, the default whenever you're dealing with another state, or to a certain extent another person or an organization or really anything in life, is your default assumption should be that the other party is rational. Now, obviously, if you have direct experience and knowledge that the other party is not rational, then you act based on that. But his point is, in the vast majority of cases, the person you're coming up against, or the state that you're coming up against, if you're a different state, is a rational actor. And to a certain extent, self-preservation, the level of organization required to maintain a state, or I guess once again an organization, or even a functional life, necessitates a moderation of certain very bad characteristics. And so, as he talks about in the book, even in dictatorships, even in totalitarian societies, there is some kind of ruling council often. There is some sort of advisory panel that has honest debates with whoever the leader is. Now, sometimes you have someone like Stalin who's completely unwilling to listen to any kind of criticism, but under Brezhnev, for instance, I believe when Prague Spring happened, there was a lot of debate and negotiation and different ideas and different parties within the Politburo when they were discussing this. So it's not quite as simple as the chairman of the Communist Party just would do whatever he wanted. He would have people he had to listen to, and this is true even in most states that are considered to be authoritarian today. The second very important thing, and I think that this is something I bring up a lot, particularly with regards to a lot of people on the left, is that just because you don't understand why a decision or action was made doesn't mean that it's irrational. There are always tons of limitations in decision making. They might have information that you didn't have that influenced their decision, and you might have information that they didn't have that would influence your decision in the same situation. They might also have different values, different priorities. And as with anything in life, there's an aspect of random chance. The specific people who are having the discussion, the deliberative process, what their backgrounds are. Maybe someone was sick one day and they didn't put in their perspective. The point is that you can have two parties with using the same theoretical framework and the same information come to different conclusions, but it's still being rational. Now, how is this possible? Mearsheimer asserts that rationality is the product of a deliberative process, and while conclusions are always imperfect, a rational decision-making process will reflect reality, or at least reflect it much better than just a guess or a gut feeling or an emotion or any other kind of arbitrary, non-deliberative decision-making process. And that's a very important thing as we kind of go through this, is he stresses that a lot of these things have to be viewed from a very meta lens. Now, this is because he's looking at states and a lot of behavior in the course of history, but I think it also, once again, applies to your life. Not every rational decision you make, not every measured decision you make is necessarily going to turn out the way you expected it to or turned out at all. But in almost all cases, you have a much better chance of things turning out good if you are making a rational decision based on a credible understanding of reality than not. Okay, so let's get into theory. And his take on theory I find is very interesting, because I find theory sometimes gets bashed a bit these days. You have all these theory channels on YouTube. You have all these theoretical thinkers in the political realm, in the media realm. And a lot of it just seems to be self-indulgent, navel-gazing, people trying to pretend that they're smarter than someone else by coming up with some unique insight. And while there is certainly an aspect of that, Mearsheimer contends that theories are, generally speaking, a good thing. They are the primary way that human beings look at the world and piece complex information together. A theory is a framework to which people will take a whole bunch of different information and experiences and data, and combined with their own reason and common sense and rational mind, they will try to put it together and come up with some sort of broader observation or understanding of how the world works. So rather than it being kind of this abstract thing that doesn't matter and doesn't relate to reality, theories are how people primarily view the world. And without theories, people would not be able to interpret the world or make any kind of prediction about the future. Now, as with anything, no theory is perfect, and theories are often disproved. An example I always like to have is that Newtonian gravity was superseded by general relativity. However, Newtonian gravity, in my understanding, basically every practical circumstance works perfectly fine. You can use it to calculate any kind of architecture on Earth. I think some spacecraft still use Newtonian gravity. it technically less complete and less accurate than general relativity? Yes, but it was a much, much better understanding of the world and how physics works than not having a theory at all. So no theory is perfect, but there are theories that are credible and theories that are not. In any kind of credible theory, you can refine over time, maybe it gets superseded by something, but it's better to have something that explains 50% of reality than something that explains none of reality, or explains 10% of reality and the rest of it is just a delusion that doesn't reflect it at all. Once again, it's very important when we're talking about credible and non-credible theories to not conflate it with success. Sometimes people come up with credible theories and they make a prediction and the prediction doesn't work out. This happens all the time. Maybe the theory works in most cases, but not all cases. There's a lot of factors that can happen, and we'll talk about this a bit more later, but I've been reading The Prince, and something Machiavelli always mentions is fortuna, or fortune. And that is always something that has to be taken into account whenever you're coming up with any kind of plan or decision, that there's all these other things that could just happen, like a hurricane could blow your fleet off course. Maybe a guard falls asleep on duty. There's all kinds of just random stuff that can happen that can influence an outcome. But it's better to be facing fortune with a credible theory and a rational decision-making process than not. So the thing I was wondering about as we're reading through this is, okay, is he going to define what a credible theory is? Because this seems like a very subjective, difficult thing to define. And I'm sure we're going to get into all of this epistemological arguments about what does reason mean, what does logic mean, what does credibility mean. And we kind of largely ignore that. And we assume kind of a basic level of common sense, like that people understand what logic is, people understand what cause and effect is, and non-contradiction is. And that's just kind of taken for granted, which I actually find very refreshing, that we can just skip past all this stuff. So he has 3 criteria for what makes a theory credible. Firstly, it must be possible, realistic, and make sense on a basic level. So just an example I came up with, a theory that we don't know for sure is that Trump is passing all these executive orders and bringing in Doge and all this other stuff because he wants the whole thing to go to the courts, and he thinks that he can win at the Supreme Court and get them to endorse unitary executive theory. Now, we don't know that for certain, but that makes logical sense given the people, given what's involved, given just what we know about the situation in general before we go into any specific evidence. Whereas taking Trump again, maybe like a theory that doesn't make sense is that Trump is actually a sleeper agent for the Chinese Communist Party, and he's deliberately trying to crash America's economy to remove the chief rival to China's world domination. Nothing about that makes any kind of sense. None of the motivations involved, none of what we know about the history of these people really go anywhere. Now, this is obviously to a certain extent subjective, but I think most people can tell if something is possible or makes any kind of sense or doesn't. In the vast majority of cases, you can make this distinction. The second part that makes a theory credible is that it must posit a coherent causal chain and not contradict itself. That is, it has to explain how things happen. To go back to gravity, you throw a ball up into the air, the energy you put in it allows it to briefly overcome the Earth's gravity. Eventually the Earth's gravity pulls it back down, and it impacts into the Earth, and its default state will be lying on the Earth unless something moves it. Once again, that is a causal chain that explains what happens from beginning to end. This is where we get into what I like to call the natural disaster view of history, where things just happen and there's no real explanation for them. Generally speaking, because something politically problematic, and I won't go into anything just to try to keep this video on topic, but maybe something happened. Actually, a good example of this might be if you look at maps of the plague, from the Black Death, you'll notice that there's this weird phenomenon where Poland is always grayed out. And it says either the plague wasn't there, there's no information available. Now, there are explanations that have come up regarding this with cats or border control or stuff like that. What may have actually happened, though, is that the communist government destroyed or suppressed a lot of historical records because they viewed the increase in prosperity that came after the Black Death as problematic to their view of economics and Marxism in general. So sometimes you will just see these gaps from one thing to another, and that'll be because there was something awkward there, or because they can't identify like what the actual causal chain is. The theory also can't contradict itself. That is, it can't posit two things that are completely at odds with each other. That kind of inherently disqualifies it. And we see this sometimes when we talk about some foreign leaders. We'll say that this person is dangerous, they lead this massive army, they're a megalomaniac, they're going to overrun the world, they're the biggest danger ever. But then we'll also have the narrative that this person's so dumb they trip over their own shoelaces, they can't beat a vastly weaker country, they're basically completely ineffective. And these two things are mutually exclusive, and either they are a threat to the globe or they're not a threat to the globe. And you can't have them at the same time, and you can't just alternate between them. You can have it be more complicated than that and say in some ways they are competent, in some ways they are incompetent. But if you posit the two extremes at the same time, that theory inherently fails. And finally, it has to have significant empirical evidence behind it. Now, as with the previous two, once again, how you would define this can vary a bit from person to person. But I think it basically means there has to be, and this is once again primarily with regards to state behavior, but I think with regards to any kind of theory, you have to go, does this have a record of working? Maybe it's some particular management theory or psychological theory or something like that has decades of evidence behind it. You can go and see, okay, companies that adopted this process of doing things on average got this much better. It certainly didn't hurt them, and we can look at that. We can go back and look at history and find examples regarding where this worked and this fit in. And there's always going to be a bit of cherry picking involved in this, because not all a theory is not going to fit all situations. But some theories you can find a lot of support for and a lot of evidence that either supports it or doesn't contradict it. In some theories, it's really hard and you have to really stretch and you have to make stuff up, and it can get really rough. So a credible theory is something that meets all three of these criteria. Once again, it's not perfect, it's not all encompassing, but a theory based on these three criteria is much better than a theory not based on it, and it's guaranteed to at least somewhat reflect reality. And just kind of as a side note, we aren't talking too much about foreign policy in this video, but just Mearsheimer identifies what he considers to be credible and non-credible theories. We have offensive realism, which is what he came up with, defensive realism, which Kenneth Waltz came up with, and liberalism. Liberalism means something rather different on an internationalist stage. We can talk about that some other time. But he obviously disagrees with it. He thinks it's kind of naive. But he does acknowledge that they do have a coherent, intellectually rigorous, theoretical framework. He doesn't necessarily agree with the conclusions or how they interpret things. But it's not, like he goes, it's not made up. It does make sense. It is a valid way of viewing the world, even if I disagree with it. And the theories that he views as being non-credible, we have neoconservatism. I don't think I need to go too much into that. He wrote a whole book about how forcibly spreading liberalism throughout the world is a bad idea. Rational choice is an interesting one because this comes out of economics, where we have the utility maximization. And one of the arguments he makes is you can only do kind of utility maximization when most or all of the variables are known to you in like a mathematical model or something like that. Reality is so complicated and there's so many different things that you can put in. It's not really possible to have kind of a mathematical model of utility maximization. Also, there's just a lot of other stuff you have to put into it. And I find sometimes with these theories and equations when it comes to economics, they don't really define things particularly well, or it's done in a very mathematical, abstract way that's just not particularly helpful. Political psychology, he thinks, is particularly bad. Now, political psychology tends to almost always boil down to X person is crazy, X person is unhinged, the decisions that X person made are because of they're narcissistic or they're evil or they're sociopathic or they're weak. And while that's certainly true at a individual level, he argues that if you look through history and you look at most state decisions, the overwhelming majority of them are actually rational, and if political psychology was true, then the vast majority of them would be irrational. That you would just see weird, crazy stuff happening all the time. And while some of it does happen, by and large, there is at least an institutional kind of logic to these things. And then some of the rest, he thinks, makes assumptions that are just a priori, or they're internally contradictory, or they are just involved in twisting a lot of things around to try to make them make sense. So, that being said, let's move on to decision making. So, first principle decision making, almost all decisions are made with imperfect information. And once again, this is true both at a national level and at an individual level. If you go to see a movie, you aren't sure if you're going to like it or not. If you go to a restaurant, you're not sure it's going to be good or not. You're not sure you're going to like the food. If you go to university to pursue a particular career, it's not guaranteed that you're going to go into that field. Maybe you find something else. Maybe something happens. Maybe technology comes about. You're always making decisions with imperfect information. Just because you're making a decision, though, with imperfect information doesn't mean you are making an irrational decision. Also, once again, and this is something I think people tend to forget, rational versus irrational decision making is not the same thing as success or failure. And that's because, once again, there's fortuna. Fortune can just come in, random chance and luck and that kind of thing is very important. Even if we're not going to say that there is some abstract concept called luck, once again, all those unknown variables, some of them might be really important and you didn't take them into account or you had no way of knowing about them, and they just come in and ruin everything. Also, there's always the matter of brute force, wherein a rational actor who's much weaker than an irrational actor can still lose, even if the one side makes all the rational decisions that are well thought out and the other side makes all the bad decisions. The sheer material advantage of one side over the other means that they're able to kind of get away with more and overcome any deficiencies in their decision-making process. So how this all kind of comes together is Mearsheimer contends that decision-making is a procedure or a process rather than an attempt to quantify success or accuracy. That is, you're going through a process to make a rational decision, and so that's what you should focus on. If you make a decision and it's wrong, but you went through a rational process to do it, then you shouldn't feel bad about it or feel stupid about it, because you did basically what was required of you to make an intelligent decision. And once again, sometimes states just make decisions that are wrong. They expect the enemy to attack in a certain place, and there's lots of good reasons to expect that, but the enemy goes in a completely different direction and overruns them, and it's a disaster. That doesn't mean they were stupid. That doesn't mean that they don't know what they're doing. It just means that they it wound up not working out. As with anything, though, a rational decision is much more likely to be correct than an irrational one. So, what are the concepts involved in, or the steps or components to making a rational decision? First, that the decision is based off of a credible theory. So, we talked about what makes a credible theory. The decision-making process has to be guided by some sort of credible theory or several credible theories that attempt to explain the situation. It gives you a good framework in which to work in. Second, decision-making has to take into account all available information on the current situation. That is, not stovepiping, not cherry-picking, not ignoring things. It's taking an honest look at what you have. You're not going to have everything, and it's important to know that if some of the information you do have is very one-sided, maybe it only comes from one source, you have to take that into account. But a rational decision always requires you using the good information you have at your disposal. And once again, we have, going back to what I said earlier, you have to account for information you do not have and potential uncertainties. So Donald Rumsfeld got a lot of flack for this, but he said that there are known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. So a known known is, to take a Western movie, you're held up in the saloon. A guy's running into the saloon. He's firing his revolver. You know that the guy's there. A known unknown would be the guy is creeping around out in the dark. You know that he's there. It's too quiet. I know that there's an ambush coming, but I don't know where exactly. So that is a known unknown. But what really gets you is unknown unknowns, wherein someone is sneaking up on you, but you're not aware of it, and they might get kind of the drop on you. So at the very least, you do your best to keep into account the known unknowns, but also the unknown unknowns that are likely to happen. Fourth, you have to have an open and honest deliberation process with minimal coercion. And he goes to a bunch of different scenarios under which, or examples, even within dictatorships or what's seen as a totalitarian society, where this happens. You have to go down, look at the information. You have to have the people are able to speak their mind. They're able to give their opinion. They're able to consider different ideas and different interpretations of the situation. Now, will this always result in the perfect answer? No. But within the deliberation process, you're inherently going to have a better outcome on average than if you don't have one. If you have people sharing ideas and bouncing them off each other and testing the intellectual integrity and feasibility of something, the end of the process of that is, generally speaking, going to result in something better. However, you ultimately need to have a decider, someone who is able to make a clear decision on what to do, on which theory to go with, what course of action to go with. And this is especially true if there's no consensus. So sometimes it's very obvious what you should do, and there's no real debate about it. But other times there's a lot of deadlock. A lot of people are going back and forth. The example he gave was the Cuban Missile Crisis, where it was very divided between the people who wanted to make a deal with the Soviet Union and do the blockade versus the people who wanted to just attack Cuba. And there was all this back and forth, and it was a deadlock, but ultimately JFK had to make a decision, and he made a decision. And so there has to be some sort of actual resolution to the process and someone who's able to make a decision at the end and act on it. So, the lessons that I took away from this book. The first one that and this is a little tongue-in-cheek, is that epistemological and metaphysical questions that are very abstract, like how can we know things? What is logic? What is reality? What is something that can reasonably happen? My cultural conception or construction of this is different from somebody else's. Internal consistency is the product of a certain culture, and it's actually not a good thing. He just kind of dismisses these. I don't even think they're really addressed in the book. He just says they're distractions, they obfuscate, they don't add anything. We have either you have a basic understanding of reality, of reasonability, of internal consistency, of causal logic, or you don't. Secondly, theories are not necessarily self-indulgent or meaningless, but they are the way that people make sense of the world. I think he says at one point, man is homo theoreticus. There's homo economicus, and he says people are generally speaking driven by their theories of how the world works. Thirdly, there are no perfect theories, only credible and non-credible ones, and you can actually make that difference. There are actually metrics and stuff like that that you can use to determine whether a theory is credible or not. Fourth, rationality is from the decision-making process rather than the actual result, and rather there's a specific success or failure. You can fail from a rational decision and succeed from an irrational one. That's not necessarily what it means. And finally, I just on the whole, this represents a very different way of looking at the world of decision making compared to a lot of the stuff we see. Like what I often will see is utility maximization, where we'll get these kind of things borrowed from economics, where we're trying to apply economic formulas and calculations and coming up with these abstract metrics to measure things that just are not appropriate, or they're used out of context, or they're just, I find there's often an over-reliance on that, or just a reliance on what's considered to be very, I guess, once again, mathematical, scientific ways. There's also just a lot of anti-realist theories, like that everything's a social construct, that, oh, this is subjective, and how you make a decision has to depend on the people involved, because some people don't view logic as something important. Some people think emotionally, and stuff like that. It's just nice to have a very simple, straightforward way of measuring whether a theory is credible or not, and how to make a rational decision based off of it. So that is the book, How States Think. The Rationality of Foreign Policy by John Mearsheimer. I'd highly recommend reading it. Once again, we didn't talk that much about foreign policy, but I just find the decision-making process and the credible theory process very fascinating. So I hope people enjoyed the video. I hope you learned something. I'm liking doing this format, so for the foreseeable future, unless it's like after a movie or something where I just need to get something out, we're going to stick to this format because I actually find this a bit easier. And I think people also find it easier to read, so it's win-win. And that was made as a result of a rational decision-making process and much deliberation based on theories of audience enjoyment or something. Anyways, guys, God bless, and I'll talk to you all later.